So inconsistency in the Russian position that, do they want to keep talking up the US threat, or do they want to kind of cash in on their geopolitical gains and start to cooperate with the US in regulating mutual relations? So this was the table that we produced, which shows that in Izvestia Gazeta and the Solovyov TV show, heavy emphasis on the grounds for possible cooperation and mutual respect. I looked in a little bit more detail at this red line issue because it is critical, and it turns out that Putin himself has been sparing in his use of the red line. He used it, as far as I could tell, once explicitly in his address to the Federal Assembly, and then a second time in response to a questioner when he was asked about the British destroyer that sailed around Crimea. He did produce this rather threatening, I think, interpretation of the red line, but it's kind of ambiguous. I think that the ambiguity of red lines is part of their strength, that your adversary kind of doesn't know where they are exactly. So there's kind of paradox there, that you want to draw red lines, but you don't want to actually draw them on the map. You want to kind of keep it as a threat rather than actual grounds for agreement. You don't want to make it explicit. That's maybe something we can think about or talk about. Finally, the paper, and all this, of course, is in the paper. I do run through the arguments around two current controversies. The Russia, on the one hand, is a degree of jubilance at the American defeat in Afghanistan, tinged with extreme anxiety about the drugs and terrorism that's going to be coming out of Afghanistan into Central Asia and into Russia, and also the instability in the whole region and role of China. India is very concerned. So I think the net balance for Russia of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan is not positive, I don't think. And then on the Nord Stream, this is a kind of endless process. The pipeline, as I understand it, is now finished, and they're just waiting to kind of turn the key, get a stamp from whatever German bureaucracies are needed. But it's not over in the US. And so the Congress lobby, both the oil lobby and gas lobby, want to sell more LNG to Europe, and the Russophobe lobby, both of which are very substantial groups of senators and representatives. They'll continue to cause trouble, it looks like, for the Biden administration in the context of the Nord Stream 2. But I'm out of time, I think, so I'll stop there and hand over the baton.
Thank you so much, Peter. Let's now give the floor to Paulina. You are muted, Paulina.
Yes. Now do you hear me? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So I'm very glad to be here. Hello, everyone, again. Yes, I have a very short time to tell about the escalation strategy, or the strategy of coercion, which is very likely for Russia's behavior during the last 2 decades, I believe. So to be brief, let me divide the evolution of this escalation strategy into 3 periods of time. One is probably can be dated since 2000 till 2014, and it is connected with the Russian inferiority in the conventional weapons and Russian need for the basic deterrence. So in this regard, the escalation strategy was just a basic deterrence mechanism. The second period is can be dated from 2014, the annexation of Crimea from Ukraine and the development of the Russian conventional deterrence policy strategy. And the third is dated somewhere around this year, when Russia understood that the escalation can be not only the military, but also a very good diplomatic tool, where military is not, where diplomacy is not really working, the usual diplomacy. So a little bit more about each of these time frames. So speaking about the first period of time, started, so I'm dating it for 2000 because it happened somewhere around the NATO Kosovo operation, when Russia was feeling itself a bit similar to Yugoslavia. It could not block, on the other hand, it could not block the military operation as the permanent P5 member. Again, it had similar problems with national minorities and human rights, which Yugoslavia was criticized for. So Russians draw the conclusion that the only way they can defend themselves from NATO on the West is their nuclear weapons, and therefore the the military strategy of 2000 was so harsh, saying that Russia can use nuclear weapons in the regional war, and also it would use it to de-escalate the conflict on the terms favorable for Russian Federation. Basically, it was the pure deterrence when Russians were very much concerned about the conventional weapons, which were in a great decline at this time. So then the next stage started at about 2014 or even earlier, when Russians not understood, but they started developing conventional weapons. And they even, in the military doctrine of 2014, they introduced the notion of conventional deterrence. And therefore, the idea of using nuclear weapons was transferred to when the existence of the state is in jeopardy. However, the escalation idea is remained. It became not so obvious and not so clear and not so at the first moments of the conflict, but it obviously remained. Plus, Russian strategy became very interesting in the way that they have started to, after the annexation of Crimea, they have started to play sort of the coercive games at the Baltic flank, threatening or first arguing the independence of the Baltic states legally, then concentrating troops and making some kind of provocative military maneuvers with heavy bombers and so on, which even made Rand to write a report in 2019 that in case of the potential conflict between Russia and NATO in the Baltic flank, Russia has the absolute escalation dominance because of the supremacy in the conventional forces, the air defense, and the understanding of the vital targets of NATO, while NATO didn't have enough of any of this. However, the good news was that Russia never proceeded further in this regard. And on the other hand, the only time when Russians reminded that nuclear card was the indirect threat, which was used in the bringing Crimea back documentary about the annexation of Crimea. So, and then it brings me to the first stage of the escalation strategy development, which started at about 2021, and from the famous, problems for Russia when, again, the President Biden called Putin a killer, then Ukraine switched off the water to Crimea, then Ukraine bought some drones from Turkey to wage conflict with Russia in Donbass, and then again, there was the famous, a lot of quotes of Ukrainian officials about the necessity to integrate to NATO. And it made Russians looking very much unsatisfied with the situation. And I think that the speech of President Putin to the Federal Assembly showed his dissatisfaction. And the Russians started concentrating troops of the Ukrainian border. Again, there were any kind of nuclear coercion there. However, the threat of escalation, of changing the borders of Europe again, was in the air. And I think that the signal was very well understood at the West, and the President Biden called Putin, and then there was the meeting. At least the presidential administration stopped blocking the Russians' Nord Stream. Again, Ukraine and Georgia never received this year, at least, the membership action plan to NATO. Again, the dialogue on strategic weapons started. So actually, and basically, Russia received everything it wanted. What it could not receive with the help of the usual Russian diplomacy. So here I have a very, dangerous tendency of making the escalation, transforming the escalation from the tool of basic deterrence, then to the tool of the offensive deterrence, as it has annexed Crimea and then included in the defensive perimeter, and then, started deterring the possible, bringing it back again in the last military document. And then at the last stage, Russia just started to play with its hard power and with the escalation threat as the way to make its diplomacy heavier, to make its diplomacy more viable. And we see that it worked for Russia. Therefore, I believe that this kind of strategy, which proved to be more or less mostly basically successful, will push Russia for the further development of escalation as a tool of foreign policy pressure, as a tool of foreign policy and gaining its aims just in the foreign policy. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paulina, for this presentation. Let's now give the floor to Adam.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be sharing the screen with everybody again. What animates my memo is a curious paradox that seems to be perpetuated, which is the rising frequency and intensity of sanctions that are applied by the West on Russia, and Russia also in a counter to the West, and the lack of real significant effectiveness, in other words, in achieving the objectives. There's been an impact in terms of pain caused, but in terms of the actual desired effects of sanctions on both sides, there's been very minimal effect. But what is most curious to me is that there seems to be on both sides mutual complacency about this situation. There's a sense on the one hand that all parties are resigned to the perpetuation of sanctions, but the sense that they can minimize the costs and continue to refine and calibrate actions such that the perpetuation of sanctions will not necessarily have a negative impact on more strategic elements to the relationship, such as the onset of strategic stability talks, the prospects potentially of arresting climate change, tackling non-proliferation, or possibly even counter-terrorist issues after in the wake of the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. So there's a sense that this curious paradox can be compartmentalized, and when the conditions are propitious for, or the political conditions are more propitious for dialogue, that the parties can get back to it, so to speak. And this last issue is what really animates this memo, because I'm curious as to whether or not this assumption, this prevailing assumption of calibration and perpetuation and minimizing the risks can be sustained. And to do so, this is part of a longer standing research effort that is trying to bring data and visual analytics to the game, and taking both a wide and narrow look at how the different communities talk about sanctions, talk about war, and what are the implications of those. So we look at a multi-dimensional set of data and try to look at them systematically. And let me just sort of cut to the chase in terms of the implications and the sort of findings that the memo tries to highlight. And it's that there's disconnect really on two planes that I think intersect, that cause potential risks in thinking about the prospects for strategic stability. One is there's a disconnect in the ways that the two communities, or the multiple communities in the West and Russia, talk about competition and conflict below the line of kinetic use of force. And there's a lot of discussion about hybrid warfare and gray zone warfare, but I would argue that the problems are much more fundamental than lexical. They're fundamentally different ways or strategies of thinking about waging this competition. And many of you in the audience have begun to write about the notion of the changing nature of war from the Russian perspective, that blurs notions of peace, competition, and war in their conception, as opposed to the American way of traditionally segregating coercive statecraft from kinetic uses of force. Now they may, economic sanctions can be seen as a precursor to the use of force, but there's a distinction between the logics of sanction and using force. Whereas in the Russian discourse, increasingly sanctions and information warfare and other forms of cross-domain competition are part of war. And as a result, the boundaries are getting blurred. And you're having, rather than the conversation being only about escalate to de-escalate where the threshold, where the nuclear threshold is lowered, the competition for non-kinetic space and including a lower level kinetic space is widening and expanding. And this is a problem that is only compounded by some of the points that Peter just raised, that we have fundamentally different strategies in waging this competition. The United States tends to be much more explicit, focuses on strategies of coercion, deterrence, compellence that is sort of graduated, linear, involves a heavy dose of demonstrating resolve and credibility, having explicit red lines, where the Russian strategy is much more indirect, non-linear, and also reflexive. And we can talk a little bit more about those, as Peter mentioned in the discussions. But there's also a disconnect in how to think about sanctions. And I've written a bunch about this, and so have others, where the Russians have a fundamentally different idea about what the purpose of sanctions are, when they're applicable, and with their notion of counter sanctions, they're not just about causing direct pain, but also demonstrating their willingness to pay costs in terms of the blowback of their counter sanctions, to demonstrate their willingness to others, both at home and abroad, to stand up against what is seen to be a more reckless US and Western foreign policies. And another dimension is that they're not just reciprocal, but they're also orthogonal. And there are several dimensions to that, and I don't want to belabor it, but I have several slides I wanted to show you this. And this slide shows you using events data, two sets of events data. And if you look at the blue and red lines, the blue lines are the frequency of US sanctions directed at Russia, and the red is the Russian sanctions directed to the US. And the red shaded area are broader Russia coercive policies and rhetoric aimed at the US. And you can see that there's a modest reciprocity in terms of Russian sanctions, frequency of Russian sanctions in response to the US, but there's a much greater response in a broader coercive posture. And this is accented when you dive in and look more specifically at the nature of that broader coercive posture. And I don't want to get into the details here, but one of the things that really stands out is the green area as the resort to sanctions. And so on the left side, it's the frequency of US sanctions directed towards Russia, and vice versa on the right side. And you can see that economic statecraft and sanctions really constitute a much smaller dimension to Russia's broader coercive response that is much more heavier on the diplomatic and on the military sphere than on the economics. And this then is echoed when we looked at about 1,500 Interfax statement or articles by the Russian leadership about sanctions in the United States. And you can see that, yes, reciprocity and general statements about sanctions matter, but there's also an increasing role of non-reciprocal responses to sanctions that is articulated by the Russian leadership. And this ranges from withdrawing from other sanctions, multilateral sanctions that the United States is leveling against Venezuela or Iran, pulling out of counter-terrorism or other non-proliferation areas, as well as much more oblique references to direct competition and red lines and issues that Peter just references. So the notion that this can be calibrated, I think, is suspect. Let me just touch on what this means for strategic stability. As Mikhail in his memo points out, there are very different definitions of strategic stability in this long-term competition, but I think the most fundamental is that neither side has a clear idea of what gray zone competition is and where that intersection with sanctions would be, and where competition in the gray zone may escalate into a vertical kinetic range. So the boundaries of response are unclear. What is seen as acceptable for sanctions-related behavior and versus kinetic warfare are unclear. There's not an emphasis on demonstrating explicit credibility of threats, let's say on the Russian side. And all of this obfuscates what restraint actually means. So a big part of competition below the line in terms of the long-term competitive relationship requires that the parties understand what restraint means. And that is really what is obfuscated here. And this suggests that notions that collective fears of the costs of war can bound the nature of non-kinetic competition, I think is suspect. So the application of the stability-instability paradox to the current situation, I think is problematic. And there are real risks of inadvertent escalation because the parties don't know where the boundaries are, where the potential inflection points are. Even if they are only opportunistic and risk-taking, they can blunder into the escalation. So what does this all mean? In essence, I think we need to have a much more broader conversation about what the contours of long-term competition mean. But more specifically, I think both sides need to begin a dialogue of strategic empathy that focuses less on the ends and means and more on the ways, and understanding how each party and their strategies, not only what the contours of those strategies are, but what happens when they interact and intersect. And then from that, defining what the opportunities are for calibrating and signaling restraint. It's very difficult for the United States to believe that it can calibrate its sanctions if it doesn't know what the Russian response is. Similarly, the Russians may think that their concept of competition below the line may inadvertently hit a very sensitive point for the US, leading to escalation. And as a result, the last thing, I think before we begin formal talks on strategic stability, we need to have a much more focused conversation on scenarios and pathways of escalation so that we know and we can find out where those inflection points are and what the mutually shared concerns of escalation would actually be. And I can talk a little bit more specifically about that in the Q&A as well. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Adam. Let's now give the floor to Mikhail.
Hello, everyone. Let me just start my own demonstration. Okay. So I hope you can see just fine. And thank you all for coming and good morning. And let me just dig a little bit deeper into this notion of strategic stability and deconstruct and debunk it in a way a little bit over the next 8 minutes. So my presentation, the starting point for my presentation is this fairly unique mechanism for the United States and Russia to send each other costly reassurance signals. And also my presentation is about how one such mechanism that you can now guess is strategic stability fell apart. This is about the rise and fall of strategic stability as a mechanism of costly mutual reassurance. So so my starting point again in developing this presentation and the underlying memo was to look for something that the United States and Russia could be in agreement about these difficult and stormy days. And that something had to be costly for both sides, as opposed to just something non-binding, unverifiable, and therefore just cost-free. Such as, for example, a declaration that nuclear war should never be fought. Clearly, you can agree that fighting a nuclear war is bad and immoral, but at the same time, you can claim that under certain conditions, you may just have no other choice but to start such a war. But now, whether strategic stability can serve as a costly mutual signal of cooperation depends on how you define strategic stability. If there's a shared definition at all. Okay, and here the first and the only consensual definition of strategic stability, as many certainly know, goes back to June 1990, when Moscow and Washington issued a joint statement in which they described strategic stability essentially as the lack of incentive to conduct the first nuclear strike. And then they said the probability of the first nuclear strike should be minimized by means of reductions, by making nuclear weapons more survivable, and by preserving the balance between attack missiles and missile defenses. And it is called appropriate relationship between offensive and defensive in the declaration. So the point of that joint statement of June 1990 was that short of declaring no first use, you could still promise not to undertake unilateral moves that would make such use more likely. And that solution was very costly for both sides making the statement. But they were still ready to pursue it in the early 1990s. Think, for example, of the START II treaty, which would have effectively banned multiple warheads from being installed on one missile because it was thought to be inviting the first preemptive strike. And it seems that since the early 90s, pursuing strategic stability was indeed the only real costly mutual commitment between the United States and Russia, including since that was indeed since the end of the Cold War. Other areas of interaction, I would provocatively argue, were pretty much transactional. Neither side exposed itself to the risk of exploitation in any other area. And I know this is super provocative, but try naming another domain of truly costly cooperative signaling between the United States and Russia since the end of the Cold War, aside from voicing commitment to a clear-cut, concise, and ethically attractive definition of strategic stability. So the state of strategic stability as the supposedly only costly mutual cooperation signal becomes an exciting issue. And here, so what happens with strategic stability after the 1990 joint statement? There's a long story of how the concept effectively became diluted and almost meaningless because of both petty and major contradictions between Russia and the United States on how strategic stability should be adapted to account for the seemingly changing reality. And there was a bit of schizophrenia. Even Russia and the United States would always acknowledge the importance of strategic stability, but would once and again undertake moves that would undermine strategic stability in its original sense, and then also even in its evolving form. And that happened when the United States, for example, decided to delink offense and defense and pursue serious missile defense program. And then, of course, Russia said it was worried about regional security in post-Soviet Eurasia, which Russia now considers part of the strategic stability equation. And of course, there were new types of weapons that supposedly had to be included in the strategic stability equation, and there was all this uproar about the escalate to de-escalate tactic that Russia was supposedly planning to employ in a conflict. And as a result of those demands, the equation, the strategic stability equation, became almost meaningless. While it is not at all clear why, despite all those technological and geopolitical trends, the sides were unable to stick to this original great and powerful definition of strategic stability as simply reducing the probability of the first nuclear strike. And the sides have instead been elevating such probability while still claiming that they somehow wanted strategic stability. And now, finally, and somewhat paradoxically, the last nail in the coffin of strategic stability as a meaningful concept were domestic regime concerns on although of a different nature. So the Kremlin has been worried about the United States supposedly trying to undermine the Russian political regime and institutions. And I believe Moscow did have some success in talking Washington out some of its policies by invoking Russia's status as the second nuclear superpower. But the cost of that was clearly reducing the credibility of commitment to a meaningful definition of strategic stability. And the United States, in its turn, claimed in its most recent nuclear posture review, of course, that the United States cannot forswear the option of using nuclear weapons against nuclear proliferators with rogue political regimes. And of course, such a statement also helped lower the threshold for nuclear use instead of making it higher in accordance with the original definition of strategic stability. And so finally, my last phrase and punchline is that we are now left almost without a mechanism or a medium for maintaining a stable system of costly signaling between Moscow and Washington. I mean, of cooperative costly signaling. There are plenty of opportunities for conflictual costly signaling, but for cooperative costly signaling, we are now left without a mechanism. And what we are left with is the commitment to conduct negotiations on strategic stability. Is it a costly posture for the side? Still, I think it is, because there are clearly advocates in both Moscow and Washington of just no strategic stability negotiations. So as long as we have this commitment, at least to negotiate strategic stability, we may still hope that neither side is up to something grossly destabilizing. And that will be. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to our 4 presenters for this great summary of their memos. I would like now to give the floor to Will for discussing the 4 papers and giving us some feedback.
Thank you, Marlene. And I would like to thank all the 4 speakers for very interesting and provocative papers. It makes me rethink what strategic stability and a lot of other terms that we use regularly mean. And I think the papers point to the fact that we need to have a new terminology, a new strategy, and a new way of signaling so that we can actually engage in a dialogue. Because if we continue to rely on old terms, on terms that we think we know the meaning of, but in fact actually lead to great disparities and misunderstandings, then this relationship will continue to suffer and will not be put on an even track. I'm just going to go over some of the papers, not in the order that they were given, but kind of thematically, and raise some questions that I would like the speakers to think about as we head into discussion. So my first comments are dealing with the last paper, Mikhail Troitsky's, and this pursuit of strategic stability. It's interesting that when the 2 sides went into Geneva for the most recent summit, they said that what they wanted were stable and predictable relations. And it raises the question, what does those terms mean? And I think what is very important about Professor Troitsky's paper is that we now have to deal with the fact that these terms, the term of strategic stability, might be obsolete and might not actually cover what we need to discuss between the 2 sides. So the question is, what does the term strategic stability mean today? I think that what Professor Troitsky says is, and I agree, is that it is not only related to nuclear weapons and the nuclear relationship between the 2 sides, but it has expanded. But how do we expand what strategic stability is? I think there is a greater confidence that from the Russian side that they want to expand this term, maybe to include anti-terrorism, to include climate change, and to include cybersecurity. but there's still a wide gulf between what we can agree upon in all those areas. So the question is really what does the term strategic stability mean today? And is there a way by which we can reach a common understanding of that term? Professor Stolberg approaches the question of strategic stability from another perspective, namely the question of sanctions. And I think this is a really important point, that the understanding of sanctions and the role sanctions play is far different from the United States perspective than the Russian perspective. As he mentioned in his paper and in his discussion today, sanctions from the United States' perspective are to weaken the economic capacity of Russia without resorting to force. Whereas for Russia, sanctions are signs of protracted conflict, blurring the distinction between peace, competition, and war. And the result is what I talked about at the beginning, this terminological confusion and disparate ways to express what Professor Stolberg talks about, regular and irregular warfare, and the consequences of this different terminology for strategic stability. And again, to repeat, the United States often talks about economic coercion, but we often say, oh, but we're also providing an off-ramp so that we can back off from confrontation, that sanctions will actually lead to a different type of dialogue, and hopefully Russia will take the off-ramp. I think we learned, especially in Ukraine, that Russia wasn't interested in taking an off-ramp, but continued to proceed to what its strategic advantages were. So I think that when we talk about sanctions and the use of sanctions, we now have reached the point where they're far too easy to implement. And indeed, it is the knee-jerk reaction, especially from the United States, but also from Russia, to introduce sanctions when there's any conflict. And once sanctions are introduced, it is extremely difficult to back off those sanctions. So I think what is important about the sanctions paper and Professor Stolberg's paper is that sanctions lead to escalation and potentially lead to an escalation that neither side actually wants. So how do we prevent an escalation of crisis, of a crisis when Russia's strategy is to rapidly escalate in order to force de-escalation? This is the point that Polina Sinevic's paper raises, and that Russia's de-escalation strategy has now evolved into Russia's security policy. And this suggests that traditional deterrence, a traditional deterrence strategy may not work, especially if Russia perceives that it possesses strategic advantages in the Baltics and potentially in Ukraine. So I think the implication of Professor Sinevic's paper is that brinkmanship essentially is the new Russian foreign policy. And the question then has to be asked is whether the United States has the internal resolve to stand up to it, or more importantly, does the United States have the available intelligence to understand where Russia is bluffing and where Russia is serious? So I think the new escalation policy has tremendous implications for both Russia and America, and again, will lead to misunderstandings and potential conflict. And so that this strategy has to be both examined and basically deconstructed so that we can actually understand, or think we understand, the intentions and motives of the Russian Federation. So then I want to finally turn to the results of the Geneva summit, and the result, and did the Geneva summit kind of represent the first step in establishing a dialogue and dealing with this terminological divide, or has it kind of run its course already? And I think this is where Peter Rutland's paper is very important because he goes into why we should be skeptical about President Putin and his resolve to confront Russia. And indeed, leading up to the Geneva summit, President Biden gave the green light to the Nord Stream 2 project. He shot down NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia. He emphasized that he still stood by the Minsk Accords. And more importantly, in the discussions between the two sides, the issue of trade, which has historically been a means by which to deal with differences and improve relations, wasn't even mentioned. As Peter mentioned in his paper, the US's messy withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, will be interpreted by Russia as a sign of weakness and of retreat for the United States. So for the panelists, there is the question of, is there any perceived common interest that breaks this cycle and can lead to constructive dialogue? And on top of this, the question also, I think, has to be raised, does Russia want such a dialogue? Professor Rutland talked about the discussions in the press leading up to the summit, and that discussion suggested that Russia was trying to change its stance and maybe would be interested in a further dialogue with the United States. But over the last 6 months, and especially over the election campaign, the attacks on the United States have been unrelenting. And the charges from Russia have been quite scurrilous. The charges coming out of Russia have said that the United States is trying to take Russia's seat away from it on the Security Council, that the US was trying to interfere in Russian elections. The Russian Federation has accused the United States on numerous occasions on downplaying the role that the Soviet Union played in World War II. And Russia has also designated the United States as an unfriendly country. So the problem is ongoing. And indeed, just today, we saw how this problem can get out of control, or how the two sides just can't find a common language to agree upon. There was a bill yesterday talking about an increase of sanctions on Russia because of Nord Stream 2. And the spokesperson for President Putin said that if the US introduces new sanctions, it will destroy the spirit of Geneva. But the last question I have for all the panelists is there a spirit that can continue out of Geneva, or in light of the profound disagreements that have been raised by the papers, is the use of sanctions and the escalation policy only predict that future problems will cause difficult and interrupt relations between the US and the Russian Federation? So I would like to thank everyone for their interesting papers, and turn it back to Marlene.
Thank you so much, Will, for your great comments. Let's now open the floor for the Q&A session. We have about 20 minutes. And I mean, you are welcome to ask your question in the chat box, but you are also welcome to raise your virtual hand. And I think it would be nice to have this kind of more workshop style discussion. And I would invite our speakers to answer Will's comments, maybe when I will give them the floor back, so we can take more questions from the room. And so I see first Olesia Tkacheva, and then we will have Mikhail Alexeyev after. So Olesia, you will be unmute by the team, and then Mikhail. Fully. We cannot hear you, Olesia, so far. No? Seems we have an issue for unmuting people. The team is working next room to try to find the solution why we cannot unmute you. So maybe please ask the question in the chat and then I will read it. Sorry for that. Yeah, but that's the same. I mean, let's try to unmute Michael, but I'm afraid the problem is on our side. Michael, can you unmute yourself? Yeah, so the problem is on our side.
Oh,
We
yeah,
cannot.
actually,
Oh, yeah.
Yay, all right.
Okay, so Michael first, and we will try to find solution for Alicia. Michael,
Okay,
the floor is
well,
yours.
Greetings, everybody. Very nice to see you all virtually. My first question is to Peter, and Peter mentioned what would be state level and interpersonal level in terms of US negative view of Russia, Navalny, killer comment, and things like that. What about the system level factors? To what extent Russia's buildup of strategic missile capabilities, such as hypersonic weapons and others, of course, Ukraine, Wagner Group in Libya, Central African Republic, other places, affect the US perception? How do we know which one plays a bigger role? I think that would kind of go a long way to clarifying the dark room. And then I have a question on escalation to de-escalation for both for Polina and for Mikhail. So for Polina, from the Ukrainian standpoint, how could the US help with that, countering that Russian strategy? And for Mikhail, an interesting kind of counterfactual, whatever counter-thinking question. If you were in the shoes of Ukrainian leaders, how would you counteract Russia's escalate to de-escalate? So these are my questions.
Thank you so much, Michael. Olesia, it seems we have difficulties unmuting you. It's fine on our side, but not on yours. So there is some kind of technical issues. I propose you ask the question in the chat, and then I will be reading it. Do we have other question coming directly? People would like to ask directly. Otherwise, I propose to give the floor back to our speaker, answering both Will's comments and Michael's questions. Peter, would you like to go first?
Yes, thanks, Will and Mikhail. And Mikhail makes an interesting point, but that would be more a study of the formation of US perceptions, whereas I was in this memo looking more at the Russian side. If I can tag on to that, my reaction to Adam's very interesting paper, that first of all, I would love to be able to produce a kind of index of hate coming out of the Russian media, which we just plug in and see what the hate level is this week or this day. That would kind of address Will's comment that things have deteriorated back to their previous level of invective in recent months. And then secondly, things like the hypersonic weapons show that Putin put on, yeah, that got attention in the West, but it seemed to me that it was mainly for a domestic audience in Russia. That, you know, what's the strategic significance of those kind of Poseidon, whatever it is, it's not clear. But it was mainly a performance for the domestic audience, and that's my question for Adam. Is you know, the very interesting kind of paradoxes of sanctions that he identifies. Is the answer that they're mainly for domestic audiences, both in the US and Russia, and that's why they're so disconnected from each other, because they're not actually interested in influencing the other side so much as performing action for domestic constituencies?
Thank you, Peter. Paulina?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, William and Misha, for your comments and questions. It can be well. I can say a lot about what can we do to understand what the United States can do to understand Russia. But I think that it's pretty easy, because Russia is sending signals for being understood all the time. I think that the first American who understood Russia perfectly was George Kennan, and still not much changed since that time. Russians, they're they are, you know, imminently offensive, but they at the same time they're passively offensive. They are never taking what is well protected, and therefore I would argue that they would never take Baltic in case if NATO would not break their red lines. And their red lines is Crimea, Ukraine, Belarus, and everything which is out of NATO now. But most of all, it's Ukraine, Belarus, Crimea, and other things. That is why, in this regard, all of this coercive steps, the escalation for the escalation, is more a function of deterrence, of the offensive deterrence, to show that if you take if you touch our vital interests, then we will touch yours. This is the main message which is constantly sent, I believe. Russians are not going to go and to conquer somebody whom they consider not belong to them. And something which is in NATO is already not theirs. However, they can pretend they want it just to make everyone else to be afraid, to understand that if you would touch us, we'll take a large part of you, will undermine NATO credibility, will put you in the verge of possible nuclear war with Russia. So the consequences will be absolutely grave, and we will absolutely overwhelm the advantages of any attempts to touch Russia's vital interests. This is, I think, this is the main message of Russia, and that is why I think that Geneva meetings they had a positive effect, because at least the dialogue started. The dialogue on the only issue which is still uniting Russia and the United States very much, the issue of strategic stability, of reductions of weapons, because everyone has their own interest to reduce different types of weapons and so on. So the dialogue can be fruitful. The other spheres, I don't think there are a lot of perspectives. However, what Russia wants is the same division. Russia just wants the same division of the world as it was before, or at least the clear lines between the fields of the spheres of influence. And this is the main demand from Russia. So if you leave Ukraine, and now maybe I'm already answering Misha's question from the Ukrainian standpoint. There is no Ukrainian standpoint here, because Russia perceives Ukraine as the property, as a part of its body, which for some reason got crazy and believes that it's different, but it's not. That is why the escalation for the escalation is basically the instrument of Russia to retain Ukraine, to coerce the West from involving Ukraine into its community. I mean, formal involving, like NATO and so on. And that is why the only way of US to counter the escalation for the escalation strategy is to give up Ukraine. Unfortunately, there is no Ukrainian interest here. It can't be reached, because it's in the sphere of the vital interests of Russia. This is why I'm very pessimistic about Ukrainian future. I mean, in the integration of NATO integration and other things on the formal level. At least since Russia is still strong and coercive. That's it.
Thank you so much, Paulina. Let me add the question of Olesia, so then both Michael and Adam can try to also answer it. So Olesia was asking, how does blurring of domains affect the relevance of the concept of strategic stability? Example of the blurring of domains is cyber versus information, conventional versus tactical nuclear. Is it an outcome of the evolving technological change or political driver? So let's now move to Adam and then Mikhail Troitsky.
Okay, well, I think the last question from the chat is really the essence of what my memo and my research suggests, is that the cross-domain context is fundamentally different than the Cold War context, where strategic stability was narrowly confined to mitigating the risks associated with an existential threat that was, at the nuclear level. And I think all of the blurring of the discourse, of the strategies, of the technologies, really have compounded the problems of coming up with a common understanding and common knowledge of what strategic stability is. So I think my answer to you is yes, it is much different. But let me go back to the points that Peter mentioned, because I think they are really important. And Peter, I appreciate the point. And, you know, is this paradox really a function of communicating with two separate domestic audiences? And so they're really talking past each other, and ultimately with a less escalatory implication. And of course, I can't rule that out, although my sense is that's not the case for several reasons. One, as I showed you, what's really interesting is not the discourse, the reciprocal discourse about sanctions. It's really, when we talk about sanctions and level sanctions, it's a much more coercive response and posture that is brought about. So it's not just about the discourse on sanctions. Similarly, we looked at various discourses about sanctions. And I think the point that you're making is one that is a very prominent conversation in Russia and across Russia, and it's evidenced in regional newspapers, et cetera, that the discussion about sanctions really has to do, there's minimizing the costs of sanctions, underscoring how the government is blunting the sanctions and the opportunities for macroeconomic stability and diversification. And so I think that's the predominant domestic conversation. It's, as I showed you in the Interfax statements, which are really designed for external audiences more than internal audiences, where there's a conspicuous augmentation or a supplement of that discourse with these broader coercive dimensions. And when you couple that with the discourse within the strategic community of Russia about both gray zone conflicts and the role of non-kinetic and economic instruments in a broader conception of war, and about the non-reciprocal nature of response to sanctions, where it gives grist that there is a dimension to this risk of what both sides may seem to be calibrated, opportunistic sanctions behavior leading to the risks of escalation. And let me just say the last point that kind of touches on William Pomerantz's point. I think it's important when we talk about strategic stability that we remember the history of the concept. It was always contested, and it was never really funded. There's a debate as to really how much it governed relationships. That said, as Mikhail rightly pointed out, the heyday was 1990, where the existential dimension to the nuclear equation really was a sobering basis for reaching common understanding about the risk of first strike, crisis stability, and arms race stability. However, again, and it takes us back to the question raised in the chat, that the cross-domain context, the gray zone context, the areas that strategic stability has been expanded to are fundamentally different than this existential domain. And as a result, it's bringing up different understandings, and more specifically, I would argue, fundamentally different strategies of waging this competition, such that the risk, even among status quo defined actors who are really thinking about being opportunistic rather than being risky, are likely to, or at least have an enhanced probability of blundering into something that they think is a horizontal escalation into a vertical escalation that could take us above the line of conflict in a very surprising context, which we otherwise would think would not be conceivable. And so that's where I think the real problem is. And again, I want to thank the person in the chat for underscoring that.
Okay, should I perhaps go next, Marlene? I think that was Marlene's intention. And I just want to thank Will and Mikhail, if I may go informal at the heat in the heat of this discussion now, for your comments and questions. So to Will's question regarding the possibility for a consensual, for return to a consensual definition of strategic stability, well, I guess I don't think we can really reach a common understanding or review a common understanding of strategic stability these days, because almost immediately after 1990, the sides began to dilute this original clear-cut definition that Adam and I just described. The definition that has to do with common survival of the humankind, and that definition, by the way, was extremely important to everyone else. Aside from the two contracting parties, because everyone else were having this hostage syndrome. They were feeling hostage to an outbreak of nuclear hostilities between the two superpowers, and they still are having this syndrome. So we should, my view is that we should stick to this originalist definition of strategic stability. And so now the differences about what should be included under this rubric have become intractable. There's no common definition in sight from my perspective, but interestingly, and what is amazing in such situation is that the sides are still willing to continue their discussion and continue pursuing such definition. And that discussion, as such, I think is a good sign for everyone and a good signal to everyone. And then briefly to Mikhail Alexeyev's question, who Mikhail asked in the shoes of Ukrainian leaders, how should I respond to Russia's escalate to de-escalate tactic, right? I think whether you believe or do not believe in Russia's escalate to de-escalate is a matter of faith, really, unless you have, some clear evidence that you, I am sure, not going to share. And I personally do not believe that there's real resolve as well as institutional capacity on the Russian side, let's call it that way, for escalate to de-escalate. So if I were a Ukrainian leader, a Ukrainian politician, I would simply discount such possibility. I believe that there's firm conviction in Russia that the world after a nuclear use is never going to stay. Right? It won't be just, the same world with Russia just prevailing by escalating to de-escalate, and everything else remains just the same. The costs are going to be enormous, and I do not believe there's the resolve and the institutional capacity, let's call it institutional resolve for that in Russia. And finally, and logically, to Dr. Tkachela's question, I think there should be a different definition for stability in US-Russia relations. So we should book strategic stability for just this survivalist, regionalist meaning, this very concise and ethically attractive one, which is basically reducing the probability of the first nuclear strike. And Russia and the United States should call it something different, should pursue stability understood as the lack of incentive to launch some kind of surprise attack to turn the table in their mutual relations. And that stability should be discussed, but should be called something else. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for these great comments. Would be good to continue the discussion. We will be getting very short on time. So, and I'm sorry for the hacker who just joined us for a few minutes and kind of kept the chat busy. We very often, in fact, have that when we have Ponars events. So we should be attracting. I will take it as a good sign. Yeah, it's time already for us to conclude that panel because we need a few minutes to prepare the second one. So I wanted to thank all our speakers for really this great launch of the discussion on these very sensitive issues of US-Russia relations and being able to bring a lot of nuances in the discussion. And thanks a lot to Will for being such a great discussant. We will now, so you stay there on this Zoom link. We will reconvene in exactly 10 minutes at 11:30. And during that time, the second panel will be preparing itself in another room. So thank you again all, and hope to see you with us for continuing this discussion. In this second panel, we will be looking at shifting patterns in grant geopolitics. We will have Pavel Bayev, Alexander Iskandarian, Irina Kabrinskaya, Elizabeth Vishnik, and our discussant will be Angela Sten. So please stay with us, and we reconvene in 10 minutes. Thank you so much, and see you all very soon. Bye-bye. See you soon.